Hi, this is Rafiq Soliman, and you are watching Cloud Simplified. Hi everyone, and welcome to another lesson from the Cloud Practitioner Express. If you remember, in the last video, we started talking about the very important concept of security on the cloud and on AWS. In this lesson, we're going to carry on what we started, and we're going to explain a very, very important concept, a key concept to understand when you are dealing and configuring infrastructure on AWS, and this is what we call identity and access management, or in short, what we call IAM. So let's start by explaining. So IAM, if I want to define it as per AWS documentation, IAM is a service that helps you securely control access to AWS resources. You have multiple users accessing multiple services, right? How can I create users and how to give them the correct privilege in order for them to do their job? And with this, let's start by the first entity, and this is what we call an IAM user. So very simply, everyone who will log into the AWS console in order to do some configuration, this is very simply an IAM user. And then, what do I do? Usually, I am going to create also something called an IAM group in order for me to group multiple users inside one group. And usually, users inside a group, they share the same privileges. And then the next thing is, I want to define what exactly can this group of users do, and this is what I define inside what we call my IAM policy. So inside the IAM policy, this is where I permit some services, and this is what I deny other services. And then, now you can ask yourself a question. I can attach my IAM policy, I can attach it to an IAM user. Also, I can attach my IAM policy to an IAM group. Which one do you think is the best practice? Because we're going to see for each and every entity what is the best practice. We're going to see that definitely the best practice is to attach the IAM policy to my IAM group. Why? So I don't need to go to user by user and attach the policy. I will attach the policy to the group, and then whenever a user is added to any of these groups, this user will inherit the policies coming from the IAM policy attached to this group. And then we have something very important as well called the IAM role. And by the way, IAM role, this is a very important and a big concept when dealing with AWS. But for the scope of the Cloud Practitioner, in order for you to be able to answer the questions of the exam, an IAM role, and remember this keyword, this is if I want to assign a temporary privilege. So it's something temporary that I want to assign to a specific user, for example, to give him access maybe during one day to do a specific function. And finally, this is something very recommended to be configured. It's not by default enabled, but it's something very recommended to be enabled, what we call the MFA, or multi-factor authentication. And this is very simply, MFA means now in order for me to log in to my AWS account, it's not only a username and password, but then it will take me to a second step where I need to provide what we call my OTP, or my one-time password, and then these two together, they form the multi-factor authentication. Let's see by one in details, and let's start by a very important concept here, and this is the concept of the root user. So whenever I create a new AWS account, now this account will be created and I can access this account with what we call the root user, or what you can also call a super user. This user has super privileges. What's the recommendation for the root user here? The root user, this is the super user within your AWS account. He can do anything inside the AWS account. And because of this, it's not recommended as per AWS recommendations. I should not be using the root user in the day-to-day activities. So AWS recommends to use it only, to use the root user only for the few tasks that require a root user. Like for example, when I create the account, and once I create the account, I need to go as a root user, configure an administrator, and then log off as a root, log in as an administrator, and only do the configuration from my administrator account. Why? Why AWS is recommending this? Because the root user, as we explained, this is a super user privileges. So if this user, for example, got compromised, the super user has the privilege to completely terminate and delete the account. The super user or the root user has the privilege of, for example, changing the support plan of the account. And that's why I should only use the root user only in a very specific tasks that cannot be done by another user. Example of these tasks is if I want to change any account settings, if I want to change maybe the email address associated to my account, if I want to change the root and the user password, for example. This is an example of using a root user. Another example, if I want maybe to restore my IAM permissions. So maybe my administrator account, there was a problem and I lost my IAM permissions or my access, then through the root user, I can reconnect again and I can restore the administrator IAM permissions, for example. And then let's now start talking by IAM user. So now you have users who are going to connect to your AWS console to start doing some configuration and to start building your infrastructure. So the first entity is what we call an IAM user. And if I want to define it, an IAM user, this is an entity that it might represent a person, a human user, or even a workload who will use the IAM user to interact with AWS services. And then we're going to see with every entity what is the best practice. And the best practice for IAM users is to create individual IAM users for each person. And this is very important and it might be a question in your exam. Why? Why do I need to create an individual IAM user for every person? And the answer to this is because of auditing. What if someone deleted an EC2 instance? What if someone created an S3 bucket? I need to track, I need to audit who did what in AWS. And that's why if I only have one account, one IAM user credentials shared between my team, if someone deleted an EC2 instance, I will not be able to understand who exactly deleted this EC2 instance. And that's why the best practice is to create an individual IAM user with a username and password for each and every person connecting to my AWS console. And then next, as we explained, the best practice is I need to add this user into an IAM user group. So this user group is a collection of IAM users, very simply, and then users group will let you specify what we call permissions for multiple users. So what do I do here in this case? Now I create the IAM user, I add the user to this group, and the next we're going to see I attach the policy into my IAM group. So this user now will inherit the policies that I have. So it will get what kind of permissions this user can do. And then next, I attach the IAM policy to groups. So again, what's the best practice here? So the best practice for the IAM group is to attach the policy not to individual users, although this is something I can do, but to attach the policy to the group of users. So I don't need to go to each and individual user to do it. I can do it per the IAM group. And then next is what we call the IAM policy. And the IAM policy, you're going to see, this is a JSON document. So inside the IAM policy, this is a document. Inside this document, this is where I specify what we call permit and what we call deny. So I can say, for example, permit EC2 instances, maybe permit Lambda functions, but for example, deny something like S3. So anyone who will be assigned a policy like this, they can access EC2 instances, they can access Lambda functions, but they cannot, for example, access S3 buckets. So for the IAM policy, as I mentioned, this is a JSON document that allows or denies what kind of permissions you want to give to this user or to this group. And again, very, very important, what is the best practice here? The best practice is to follow the concept of what we call least privilege. Very, very important, and you might get a question about this in your exam. What is the concept of least privilege? Least privilege means do not over provision. Only assign for this user or for this group only the permissions or the privileges, the minimum privileges that they need in order for them to do their job. Do not over allow any kind of services here, and that's the concept of least privilege. Only allow the services that will make this user or this group do and perform their functions. And then we came to the IAM role, and as I mentioned, the IAM role is a big concept when we talk about IAMs in general, but for the scope of the Cloud Practitioner, the IAM role, for example, this is the IAM identity that you can create in your account that has some specific permissions. And always remember the keyword here, it provides temporary security access. So for the IAM role, the keyword for your exam, now if I want to provide some temporary access to a certain service, for example on AWS, in this case I am going to use an IAM role. Very good. And with this, we come to the end of this lesson. I hope now it's clear. What do you mean by IAM, identity and access management? What do you mean by users? What do you mean by groups? What do you mean by policies? What do you mean by roles? And finally, multi-factor authentication. So I hope this is now clear. If you have any question, please let us know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next video. Thank you.